The Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, prohibits discrimination or harassment in any aspects of employment against someone with a disability, according to the ADA's definition of a disability. This could include someone who currently has a disability, has a history of having a disability, or was regarded by the employer as having a disability. The law also protects people from discrimination based on their relationship with a person with a disability. For example, it is illegal to discriminate against an employee because her husband has a disability. The ADA's definition of disability is complex, so please consult with Human Resources to determine if someone has a disability under the law. Generally, any impairment that substantially limits a major life activity is considered a disability. The ADA strictly limits employers when it comes to asking job applicants to answer medical questions, take a medical exam, or disclose a disability. Please remember, you may not ask job applicants if they have a disability, or about the nature of an obvious disability. However, you may ask applicants whether they can perform the job, and how they would perform the job, with or without reasonable accommodation. Once an employee is hired, you can only ask medical questions or require a medical exam if medical documentation is required to support an employee's request for an accommodation, or if you believe an employee is unable to perform a job successfully or safely because of a medical condition. Tests for illegal use of drugs or alcohol are not considered medical examinations, so they are not subject to the ADA's restrictions on medical examinations. In the case of drug or alcohol use, applicants and employees currently engaging in the illegal use of drugs are not protected by the ADA. However, alcoholism is considered a disability and is protected under the ADA if the employee is qualified to perform their job. This does not prevent you from disciplining or terminating an employee who is an alcoholic when the use of alcohol negatively affects job performance or a policy is violated. For example, the city's policy states that employees are prohibited from consuming alcohol while on call or on duty and cannot report to work under the influence of alcohol. An employee considered an alcoholic by the ADA must still follow this policy and can be disciplined for violating it. An applicant or employee who has a disability must still be able to perform the essential duties of the position with or without a reasonable accommodation. Examples of reasonable accommodations include a modified work schedule or work duties, unpaid time off, a modified workspace, reassignment to a vacant position in the city, or acquiring or modifying equipment or devices. If an applicant or employee who has a disability requests a reasonable accommodation, we must provide one unless it would cause significant difficulty or expense, also known as undue hardship. We do not have to provide the exact accommodation that is requested, and if more than one type of accommodation would suffice, we may choose which one to provide. As a supervisor, you need to pay close attention when an employee requests an accommodation or states that the employee has a condition that is interfering with their ability to function normally. The employee does not necessarily have to use the term accommodation when making a request. For example, an employee might say, "I'm having trouble getting to work on time because of medical treatments I'm undergoing." This would be considered a request for an accommodation. Please consult with Human Resources before making a decision about whether or not an employee should be allowed an accommodation. It is important to hold a dialogue with the employee to ensure that the employee's needs are met. We must consider each request for reasonable accommodation and determine 1. Whether the accommodation is needed, 2. If needed, whether the accommodation would be effective, and 3. If effective, whether providing the reasonable accommodation would impose an undue hardship on the city. The duty to provide reasonable accommodation is an ongoing one. If a reasonable accommodation turns out to be ineffective, the employee has the right to request an additional or different accommodation. If there is no alternative accommodation, it might be possible to reassign the employee to a vacant position, as long as the employee meets the minimum qualifications. If an employee receives an accommodation, the employee's coworkers may wish to know why that employee is being treated differently. The ADA does not allow supervisors to tell other employees that an employee has a disability or is receiving an accommodation because of a disability. If you are approached by coworkers about another employee's accommodation, you could respond that you will not discuss one employee's situation with another in order to protect the privacy of all employees. You can also assure the coworker that the employee is meeting the department's work requirements. You are responsible to understand this complete section. Please take the time to read over it in the Supervisor Guidebook. Please contact Human Resources with any questions.